those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Charles Harry. I'm both a research professor here in the School of Public Policy as well as the Information College, but I'm also director for the Center for the Governance of Technology and Systems, or GoTech. So we've got some members of the GoTech family that are here, including Bill Sisson, who's the research director. Adam is one of our master's level GAs. We've got some other affiliates that are also here, and of course, Ryan, who is joining us today and is going to be giving us no doubt some very interesting things to think about. I wanted to really just kind of give you a little bit of background about our guest here, Ryan Lewis. As you're going to hear in his bio, the one thing that I always like to highlight is he was a student here once. He was a student here in the School of Public Policy, and I mean, I must be getting old because I think I remember when you had your last semester here. So I'm definitely getting older, but it's always really, really nice to see what our alumni do, right? When they go out in the world. And let me give you a sense of Ryan's background here in a second. And the reason I like to bring it up is for those of you that are undergraduates or graduate students getting ready to kind of head out into that big world. It's exciting. I know it's a little nerve-wracking. I know it's a little scary, especially in kind of more turbulent times, but honestly, you guys are going to do great and wonderful things. So our guest today is Mr. Ryan Lewis, and he's recently been appointed as the new Chief Executive Officer for Rancher Government Solutions, which is a company that develops secure open source software for critical missions in the US government. But before that, Ryan was a senior director with the SRI Ventures team, where he invested in early stage companies across sectors and structured spinouts by leveraging intellectual property and expertise from SRI's R&D labs. And before that, Ryan was a senior practice manager of artificial intelligence for Amazon Web Services at AWS. It's in national security. Is it directorate or group or?
Well, yeah, now it's its own business unit, but back then it was all kind of rolled up into one.
Okay.
Yeah.
He led technical teams delivering a wide variety of AI products and services to U.S. national security organizations. And before he joined AWS, Ryan was the senior vice president and director at Intel Labs, where he applied research teams focused on developing and open sourcing AI algorithms and associated software. For those of you that have never heard of Intel's, can we call it the CIA Venture Capital Group? Or,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. On the website.
That's right. I was going to say, I think we can say that. So Ryan started his career at Computer Sciences Corporation, CSE, providing U.S. government organizations with account management and software engineering. So Ryan holds a bachelor's degree from Truman State University and a master's degree from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, where he was named a Memorial Fellow. He's also a GoTech affiliate and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies with the International Security Program. Ryan, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thank you for making time today. Before we even kind of get into it, and this is going to be a crash course in sort of the defense industry and how the U.S. government in particular, but this applies to allies as well, attempts to buy and direct different technologies it needs to complete its mission. So we'll get into all of that. But before we even do that, how many people here have thought about working right inside the defense industry for one of the big primes, working for a technology company that's maybe supporting the federal government, none of the above, maybe in the military? Still shaking your head? A lot of people. Okay. Right. And that's interesting. And that's really encouraging because we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But certainly when I was a student here, and Bill over cocktails can tell you, he kind of even had to twist my arm, right, to jump into the industry. It was not something that when I was a student, a lot of people here jumped into. In fact, a lot of it was unknown at the time. And I think one of the reasons I was so excited to come here today is to talk a little bit about it, because there was a lot of things I certainly learned, perhaps the painful way or through trial and error. But first, I wanted to start with this cartoon vehicle here. How many people know what this vehicle is? Yes, I know what Bill knows what it is. Yeah, you raise your hand. Yeah, that's right, MRAP. There you go. So I want to highlight this story for all of you because it was formative in my own time here. So it's my first semester here. Bill, you may remember this, but one of the first projects that was assigned to me, and it was sort of the trial by fire, I think I learned after the fact, was that at the time, the predecessor to GoTech, or what we then called the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise, say that fast. We were doing, or the center was doing a project for the Defense Science Board, DSB. And this is something that was very timely when I was a student. So I started as a student here in 2007. So from 07 to 09. And at the time, right, particularly with the escalation of global war on terror, one of the key focus areas that was in the news constantly, and thus the Defense Science Board was focused on it, as well as our university, was why is it so hard? Mainly it was through the lens of the Marine Corps, but writ large, the US military and allied forces. Why was it so hard to buy and rapidly deploy these mine-resistant vehicles with technology that was dating back, the original technology for the hull of the vehicle, dating back to the war in 1970 in Zimbabwe, or sometimes known as the Rhodesian Bush War. And the reason I like to highlight this was this really opened my eyes to not just how the industry kind of works, but how complex it is, how many players are involved. And even in this case, that's a picture of then Senator Joe Biden. This was an initiative that had support from the Marine Corps Commandant. It had support from NATO ISAF, which was the primary allied force construction at the time. And it also had support from the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates. And yet, over 2 years, it was this endless drumbeat about why the Corps can't produce these vehicles and field them quickly. Now, the answer to that, and I like to think that the center, we helped write part of the DSB response. I highly recommend reading it. But it was really one of a question of capability versus requirements. When the war force started, particularly in Iraq, this was not something that was really on people's minds. Essentially, IED, or improvised explosive device resistant vehicles. And so very quickly, the department had to understand what was happening, identify the new technology, build all the processes to field and deploy, and do all that very quickly in a very public setting, because lives are being lost. And so the reason I like to highlight this is, one, it opened my eyes to this whole universe that, I'm originally from Missouri. I knew no one when I came out here. I lived in a basement about a mile down the road here with 2 dudes that worked at USDA. So it was a really weird environment. And started out of the gate, I thought, I don't know what I'm going to make of the whole DC area. But in addition to shaping how I look at the world, but also this raises a similar question to a lot of the things we're seeing in the news today, which is a lot of people here knew what? We want these vehicles, we need them, they need to go faster. But there was this ultimate question of like, how do you do this in a way that is somewhat repeatable and somewhat follows some policy process? And so for today, I have a couple aspirations. We'll talk through that. As Harry mentioned, I was a student here too. I survived. And then we can talk a little bit about what's happening in today's scene, both in the broader defense industry, what that means for new funding initiatives that are happening, and what those initiatives allow for new entrants into the market. This is a lot in a very short period of time, and we stop at 1:15, right? Okay. All right, so I'll try to leave a lot of time at the end just for us to talk about stuff. And as I put in this sort of catch-all, making sense of the change. All right, so this was kind of fun, I promise. Before we get into sort of the background, aspirations, right? As I mentioned, just what's the intersection of this whole industry and public policy? Certainly when I started here as a student, I knew I wanted to do something. I did not know exactly what. Bill can share some of the horror stories as I started working for him. I had always been a technologist at heart, mostly breaking things like all of my parents' first computers, but I knew I wanted to be involved. But I had really no direction or vector into what that meant and where maybe the best way was for me to make a contribution. So hopefully from today's conversation, you maybe get a sense of where there's something that's of interest and maybe not. The second part is just a little, this is going to go really fast. This is used to be, at least here, when I was here, it was 2 courses just on understanding the acquisition system itself. Right, so this is going to be kind of rapid fire, and we can dive into things as you have questions. So just stop me at any point. Then at the tail end of this, we're going to talk about some of the alternative acquisition mechanisms that exist today. As Dr. Harry mentioned, I've spent a majority of my career oscillating between what we would call an operator, so someone that is running a profit and loss or P&L business, now running a business, running some part of a business, or as an allocator, someone that is investing in businesses or looking to take a board seat and help drive where those businesses are going to go. And so, sitting on both sides of the table, someone that's trying to drive the business and work with the government, and someone's trying to direct the business and help figure out where the most valuable allocation of capital can go. And so we can talk a little bit about why this matters so much in today's context, because this was not a thing, certainly when I was a student. And last but not least, what does that mean for careers? All right, this was kind of fun. This is memory lane. It took me a while to dig these out. This is me, same bad haircut, nothing's really changed. But this is Bill. Look at this. I had to find this one, Bill. This was that was graduation day from our center, and that was Dr. Gansler who led it. And really, I put a post on this. Very few moments. I'm not being hyperbolic. There have been very few moments in my career. I think all of you, I hope, have these moments that shift how you look at the world and what you end up spending either your entire career doing, or at least, if not that, change how you view the world, right? And it is not an exaggeration for me to say it changed everything, right, for me. I was dead set at the time in supporting our nation, or the U.S., as really a government employee, mainly serving on either the intelligence side or the defense side. I was locked in on that. And really through my time here and through then interning while I was a student here at CSC, I became very much caught up in this world of how can technology service the US government and our allied partners. And had you asked me that when I left Missouri, I would have said, I don't know, I like computers, right? I like programming, right? I wouldn't have thought, or I wouldn't have been particularly articulate about what that meant for the career. But it's also important to understand the scenes. You live, as Dr. Harry mentioned, a very dynamic scene. This is where I start sounding like an old person. But while a lot of things are unprecedented, this was the scene at the end of 2008 into 2009, the time I graduated, right? And so this dominated the news. I was actually planning to intern. I was in New York for an interview with the brief aspiration of maybe being an economist. Occupy Wall Street was unfolding right when I was there. And I remember I was coming out of the building, and I was an intern. I had one tie and I had one suit, and people were screaming and throwing stuff. Anyone was coming out of the building, I was like, just don't ruin the suit. It's the only one I got. And I didn't even know what was going on. I was like, just come on, I just got this tie. And at the same time, in the national security world, in the beginning of 2008, then President Bush announced this whole troop surge into Iraq, which dominated, right? If you were in the NatSec world, or what we then called ISIP world here at the school, that's all you were talking about, right? With a few exceptions. And then on the tail end of this, President Obama is elected. And that election was a Rorschach test for so many people, and certainly in this school, but across the nation, looking and saying, we have to make policy changes. So that, again, these are all things that were dominating discussion when I was coming out. And a lot of my friends, both here and in other schools, were rocked by all of these events. And so while today I was just, when I was driving up, they were saying, it's the worst day on the S&P since, or worst April in S&P since 1932, right? The market is one type of weighing machine. It's not the only weighing machine, certainly, but similar threads when I was coming out. And so there's a lot of, there was a lot of angst in kind of where to go now. And so I put this up to say I can empathize. But that doesn't mean that there aren't areas to really make a serious contribution. So when I say seen, what do I mean by that, right? To boil it at its simplest level in the US and allied national security environment. And I was going to put like some Mr. Beast references on the new, but then I realized I didn't fully understand any of that. So I just went back with cool little defense graphics. But this is the old, right? Like to highly oversimplify, right? Large, exquisite systems that are expensive, maybe take years to build. Very few nations have the ability to even build them and field them and maintain them, are now, in theory, being replaced by the new. Low cost, highly permissive, low barriers to entry, right? And highly attributable, meaning that exquisite systems can be overwhelmed, right? And now this gives greater parity to non-state actors, gives greater parity to emerging players on the national security spectrum. So the thing that we in the policy world, right, wherever you sit, whether you're a military officer, whether you're a government official, whether you work in industry, whether you're in academia looking at all these issues, all these have different implications from a policy perspective. At the highest level, we should ask ourselves, does this framing even make sense? When I was in school, I showed you what was going on in 2009. There was very little discussion, certainly in the universe in which I occupied, about what it really meant to look at our operations, both the US and allied operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was very much a question in a lot of the policy circles about optimizing against the challenge. What does it mean to nation build? What does it mean, right, to have policing effects? And so fast forward to today, as we see new capital going into emerging capabilities, it says, well, is it really bad? Should we really throw all the old things out and bring in all the new things? It's good to ask these sort of questions. I wish I would have done that more earlier on in my career. Well, you can look at this and say, yes, framing, get rid of the old. What this shows you here, a buddy of mine did this at CSIS. Really great analysis. I can send you all the links afterwards. But what this highlights here is that really since the end of the Cold War, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, we've had defense companies, such large primes, increasingly become isolated from the rest of the US and somewhat allied economies. That the defense sector as an industry, or what we would say sometimes in the biz, ADG, aerospace, defense, and government. If I use a lot of this slang, does someone throw something at me? Bill, I'm looking at you. What that means is that you'll have, unlike a lot of the rest of our economy, and we're seeing this now play out in real time with some of the economic policies being discussed, where everything's increasingly intertwined and leveraging a lot of the other capabilities and developments that are happening across the engineering spectrum. That's less so here. Now you have a subset of companies that can start to control how customers interact, high barriers to entry. So let's say, how many people here have ever thought about starting a company or working at a startup or have done that? So a couple. Imagine if, what's your name? I'm looking at you. You raised your hand.
Rohan.
Rohan. All right. So me and Rohan are starting a company, right? We want to get into this industry, and he and I are going pitching investors. Some joker like me, the investor's going to look and say, "Oh my God, this looks awful." Rohan, go find a market where you can attack. Like, what are you doing? You're going to burn so much of my money up front just to even figure out you can get in front of a customer. Pass. And so this becomes insulated. Right, so it's easy to look and say, wow, that's kind of a staid market, a monopsony buyer with maybe duopoly suppliers. That doesn't sound great. But remember, we also mentioned, the stock market is a weighing machine, not maybe the best one or the only one, but it's one worth investigating. And what this shows you here is that for the last 2 decades, this is a crazy analysis that came out of Brookings. For us in the policy world, I cannot believe people weren't talking about this on Twitter. They should be. This is right behind Taylor Swift updates. This should have been number 2 in my view, right? That the index of defense technologies represented in blue outperformed the NASDAQ for almost 20 years. And if you think about everything that has happened just in my lifetime, coming out of this school, the arrival of the iPhone, everything from there, this shows this is a highly risk resilient, highly financially performant sector that has established a very strong signal for requirements from customers. Stuff works. The aircraft carriers that we see, they go out and do things. Even in the current, even in current warfare, to focus on defense products for a minute, what was one of the big headlines in the news, right? In the Ukrainian theater in 2023, the delivery of HIMARS systems. These are exquisite systems developed by large defense primes. There was just an article 2 weeks ago talking about intercepts from Russian military forces forward deployed, where they're talking about actually basing their maneuvers about figuring out where the American equipment is and trying to maneuver around it. Well, that's just an analog, but it's worth highlighting, right? That this sector, while isolated, while highly captured and controlled by a single customer, produces things of value, and the market has weighed in on that. So we have conflicting data. Can we learn anything, right? I'm not a big music guy. My brother is. So through osmosis, I've learned a lot of things about music. So don't ask me to name my top Ramones song. I cannot do it for you. He listened to whatever. But I did read the book. He used to give me all these books about music. And since I can't play, I figure I just read. But how many people here know the Ramones? I'm probably getting really old. All right, a couple people. There's a neat story. It's a cool history. Check it out. There's a couple podcasts on this too if you ever want to listen to it. But one of the things that came out about the punk rock movement that's really interesting is this whole movement about how these bands got started in something, the main bar in New York in East Village. It's still there today. It's called CBGB's. It was all about what they called the scene. What bands were playing, in what order, and how they were graduating out of what was then called, sort of the insider movement, insider punk movement, and became mainstream, right? And what was interesting about this is that if you kind of learn from all this, is that while every band wanted to be kind of the outsider, eventually as they got more and more popular, they become the insider. Right. And so I try to take that lesson when I look at the defense sector and realize, is it really completely out with the old, in with the new? Or from a policy perspective, are we looking at something where we're almost seeing a rebaselining of the defense industry? Because by the very nature of startups, they can't sit right as an alt band forever. They eventually graduate, or they're eventually playing, at weddings part-time. Hold on. There we go. So another way to frame this is, the way I like it is, I want to take established requirements. We're going to talk about how those get generated against taste. So we're going to go back to the Rohan example a couple of times about how any entrepreneur, our taste versus what we see in the market today. And this, I would argue, certainly in my career since I've left, has been the central point of friction and excitement that I've had the opportunity to participate in over the last, hard to believe, almost 16 years. So first, right, has anyone here, do you all take just an overview of the defense market, how it works, how the budgeting cycle works? All right. So we're going to do not complete justice to it. We're just going to do a high level primer, right? Because I learned really quickly, certainly when I was what is now a buzzword, but then it was not, a special government employee, that there are whole divisions of people dedicated to acquisition and planning support. And this is an entire career in of itself, should that be something you all want to pursue. So I'm not going to do justice to it, but at large, every year, right? I'm just going to focus on the defense budget because intelligence budget isn't released, but this is a good exemplar for what it means to participate in this market. So that number is huge. Almost $1 trillion as of last year's NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. I can tell you, I have had more than 10 startups pitch me in my past career that says their total addressable market, like Rohan would come in, he's like, I got a business idea for you. And my total market is 800 million. I'd be like, oh, Ryan's not starting out great. Let's pull them back. And the reason that is because yes, that is a massive number, but the Defense Department and Dr. Aaron Bill can tell you this better than I can. Does everything at the epitome of scale. Like there's some like funny stat that I think the DoD is the biggest maintainer of like golf courses in the United States or in the world, right? So just even some silly exemplar like that is to the extreme. And so when you look at this budget, it's less about the number and much more about what are you trying to do? And what are you trying to contribute? Whether you're a government employee trying to get the optimal output or ultimate capability for either the front of the house, or what we would call back in my day, the tooth, the lethality piece of war fighting or intelligence, or the tail, the support functionality, the back office, what drives, right, the operations to enable the intelligence operator or the warfighter. And so all these different all these different shades of money all have their own purpose. We're going to talk primarily for the sake of today with new technology about this, which if you ever work in the industry, you will come to have all these things codified in your brain, whether you want to or not, but RDT&E, research, development, testing, and evaluation. We'll be talking mainly about that today. And what's interesting here is that these priorities change. It actually change a lot more than you think. And even subtle changes. I didn't really respect this when I was a younger student, but I have more appreciation for it now, is that even what we would consider nuanced changes in language have massive implications for how this machine moves, right? So when I was a student, even though it wasn't even written sometimes, it was the belief that we would operate in the United States and allied forces would operate, right, in non-traditional environments, as well as being able to fight two wars at once. That was just assumed that these things would happen. And so the entire force structure and acquisitions that go behind it were driven behind that. That's changed, and actually rather quickly, in that to say, well, now this is kind of this throwaway language, in my view, about where United States and its allies fit, where we want to defend the Indo-Pacific region and our allied interest and our interest there, but we also have these other interests in Europe and in elsewhere that also present a challenge. So how do we think about that? This is the highest level view of how the acquisition process works. If you want to enter into a realm of sadness, or if you can't sleep at night, like if you've been like really working hard, just go to this. I highly recommend this. Go to Defense Industrial Initiatives Group. Lots of reading for you. You'll fall asleep like that. And this is probably one of the most discussed and analyzed processes you can find. We're going to poke fun at it today. But the reason we want to highlight it is that when you think about any new technology, imagine you're a policymaker. Someone says, we have to, how many times have you heard, let's step back for a second. How many times have you heard that, allied forces, the United States, we will achieve our goals through technology, out-innovate? I hear that all the time. Does anyone know what that means? Adam, do you know what that means? Oh, Adam, I was really leaning on you for an answer. Anyone else? Opinions? Thoughts? And I have a lot of friends on the government side, and when that question is posed to them, let's say they're in an intelligence agency, ultimately all that thinking and planning and strategizing finds its way through those RDT&E dollars into some sort of program and testing cycle. Let's say we're back to Rohan. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep picking on you. Unless someone else wants to be picked on, raise your hand. Or if Rohan walks out, then I'll find someone. But ultimately, we're thinking about new technologies. Well, we can't just bring them in, right? We have to figure out how they fit in. How do we test them? How do we evaluate them, right? That's where these different colors of money start to matter. You'll hear people particularly inside the Pentagon, call this the old 6-point budget codes. You'll hear people rattle these off like their kids' names, as if everyone should know them. Really, where we're going to talk about is in what you'll see let's call it .2, .3, right? Which is your whole goal of any technology in this process whether you are a defense prime, whether you're a startup, whether you are someone evaluating technologies for an FFRDC or for universities, you're thinking about how they're working their way through this life cycle. And in a perfect world, this works linearly. We do good work, we continue to progress, there's funding, and so on and so forth. But reality is tricky, and ultimately, this doesn't always work this way. How many people of you here have heard about Valley of Death for technology? Silicon Valley or anything? So certainly, right? The classic valley. I've lived this. I looked so much younger before this, before I was exposed to it, right? Is in here. Is once you get past your prototyping and demonstration, and you said, I have built something really compelling. I've shown it to you in a TX or an exercise, something like that. It's now time for a major contract. What do you got for me? And then you're left kind of sitting waiting. That is where you see kind of companies begin to struggle with going back to those barriers of entry I mentioned earlier. And so the whole point on this is that this system is neither good nor bad. This is essentially how major institutions like the Pentagon have to move. But like any system, there are those that can benefit from it better than others. I'm going to come back to this one in a second. So I just love this chart. This was actually taught to us. This was from the Defense Acquisition University, and this was their catch-all chart. And I just remember they made me go to some acquisition class, and the guy that was teaching it was just like, all right, everyone good? All right, check. Right, we got it. Everyone square this away. But what happens in this system is that you'll now have essentially a series of prime contractors. There's many reasons why this happens, but a series of prime contractors that will dominate a majority of the contract awards within this system. Now, they may have a series of what would be called second tier or third tier suppliers, which could range from really cool startups to a manufacturing shop that's existed for over 100 years, right? So there is a great diversity here, and to be fair to them, they have incentives and goals and venture capital arms to bring in as much new tech as they can. So they don't, to cast them in a singular light as indifferent to bringing innovation is not true. They also have substantive innovation groups of their own. But again, we're looking at this huge budget. We're looking at what it means to bring in new tech. You, as a decision maker or policy recommender inside the government, are trying to figure out how to do that. You know, and you're looking at the budget. This kind of tells you where a lot of your money's going. So the first question out of your mind is this a good way to spend our money? In other words, right, are we, as a teacher here is to say, show me an incentive, I'll show you an outcome. Are we creating the right incentives to produce the right outcomes that we want? As we started at the top of the argument, the current scene and the current discussion here in Washington is no good, it's bad. The reality is that it's much more complex than this, in that going back to, you know, the biggest top line funded items, you'll see CTAs, critical technology areas. They're currently 14 dictated by the Pentagon, which are neither here nor there. It's just what they've decided to select. There's a lot of cross participation here, right, in terms of systems that are being built and deployed today. Some of the best systems, I'll give you an example. This is one I participated in. So this is when I was running one of the AI groups at Amazon. We had a program, or we were participating in a program that was has been in the news a lot for the DoD, about doing automated targeted recognition for different overhead and ground systems. And just to give you some sense of the complexity of that system, yes, Amazon, leader in cloud services, and its AI group, very strong, right? If you measure it by number of patents, number of research papers, number of people contributing code base to core products, however you want to evaluate it, there's an argument to be made. But we were simply building the algorithms to do some of that automated target recognition. Prime contractor was a mixture of Lockheed Martin and how many people here have heard of Palantir, right? One of the highest performing stocks, right, this whole year, and is a defense tech stock. Palantir was the other integrator. And so if you were to look at that contract, you'd say, wow, we have one of the primes, look, it rolls up to them. But if you unpack it, well, it's actually a combination of new capability and old capability. Because what were we putting all these cool ATR models on? Well, they were going on different types of ISR platforms, or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems, some of which have to operate at 9.9's level of performance, right? So you can't do anything, you can't put anything on those birds, right, that alters their ability to fly, to have their active countermeasures, or impacts anything on the power bus that would impact their ability to operate a weapon system. And so, you know, I learned that the hard way the first time I showed up at a test flight, and I was like, oh, I got this cool tech, I want to deploy it. And the guy's like, get away from my aircraft, I don't even know who you are. And I was like, oh, I was told to come here because I don't care who you are, go away, go over there and stand in the corner and get yourself a cup of water. And so all that to be said is that maybe the net total out of all of this is that any theater of conflict is often fielded. We can never know exactly how it's all going to work, but it's often fielded with a mixture of new things, as we're seeing in any current conflict today. But it's also fielded with old things too, to use that term somewhat pejoratively. And so right out of the gate, now we're back to looking at our budget and how we incentivize innovation. The answer is more complex. It's not simply just an effort of how do I get more money in the hands of new entrants? How can I do that as fast as possible? You may look at all this data and you may come to that conclusion. That's your objective. You also may look at it and say, that's not my objective. I have other things I want to achieve. And it's worth noting that this current environment, you know, it did not happen overnight, and it did not happen simply because, you know, someone said on high, there shall be 5 or 6 or 7 major companies. At the end of the Cold War, certainly after 1993, with a lot of defense budget consolidations, you know, certainly something I learned a lot from Bill and Dr. Gansler when I was here. Great book, I highly recommend reading, called Affording Defense. One of the core initiatives was that the United States government at that time, certainly allied governments across the world, could not afford to keep maintaining this volume, this size of industrial base. And this initiative, right, to buy commercial first, or to do dual use technologies, both commercial, also serving the public sector markets, allowed the government to offload some of that RDT&E costs. And so what happened was that a lot of these, there's a lot, I'm being very high, painting a huge broad brushstroke here, but what happened is that in order for, like any other sector, in any other market, wherever you go work, once you leave here, you'll find, to optimize capital allocation, these companies started consolidating. And this didn't clearly happen overnight, and also didn't happen without the government's purview. The government has witnessed this unfold. And so when you hear the news about a lot of these early policy-making decisions about reindustrializing the United States, about rebuilding out our military industrial base or our critical technologies industrial base, is that some of it is not just looking through the lens of what we were talking about, of how do I get new stuff, but now it's looking at a different policy requirement, which is, I want more of this. I want more competition, or at least I want greater diversity in my supplier base. Those may be entwined, but those may not be from a policy perspective. So that's the market. That's why you have integrators kind of operating the way they are, and you still have somewhat of a gateholder system. But I mentioned, you know, requirements versus taste, right? So, you know, as I put it here, you know, why does taste matter? Like, why do we even care, right? If we really wanted to tweak the whole industrial base, let's do so. The government has numerous mechanisms in which to do that, I'll give you an example. Certainly during my early days when I was on the technical professional services side at CSC, we would bid on contracts. It would say, thou shalt have this much money go to small businesses. Of those small businesses, they have to be blank amount in these parts of the United States, blank amount that are women owned, blank amount that are servicing this amount or this type of technology. It was written in the contract. And you could argue, we'll do more of that, and you'll force greater diversification across your industrial base. But the reason we don't just think with that lens, or you all can't think with that lens, or we all can't, is that something's happening outside the market as well. I mentioned in my career, I've been fortunate to kind of bounce between two worlds, more by accident than by design. Bouncing in this world really matters. So what is this world? Well, we mentioned at the end of the Cold War, we saw consolidation of the defense industry. And through that consolidation, it starts building all those primes build their entire go-to-market strategy around how to work with the government, how to build their sales systems, how to build their lobbying systems. So all that's happening in one hand. And as we said, that sector is getting increasingly isolated from a financial sense from the rest of the market. Well, all that's going on at the same exact time, you're seeing a complete divergence that has never been seen before in the history of the United States at the end of the Cold War, where for the first time ever, the US government, represented there by the yellow line, its total expenditures and R&D start to get eclipsed by the private sector. So as funding goes down in one area, it starts to rip in another. And what's crazy about this chart, this is from JP Morgan, this is from NSF, the next one's from JP Morgan. But what's crazy about this chart, and I have to put it here, I couldn't do the math in time, is that this doesn't calculate any insertion from capital markets, right? This is just what public sector or public companies are reporting on their R&D. So this is obviously any company in the NASDAQ and anything in the S&P. This doesn't count private equity, venture capital, debt financing vehicles. If that was the case, this thing would be off the chart. You wouldn't even see the red line. It'd be somewhere up there. And so that tells you the size and scale of change that's happening in commercial markets. And we all live in that world. I mean, you all better than me. I mean, I still remember a day. I mean, it was a long time ago, but I still remember a day when programming with things like open source code would have been, no one would even know what you're talking about. And now we take that things for granted. But this has fundamentally changed and forces the government to think differently. Going back to that old versus new, the scene that we exist in today, part of that scene is being driven by this. And that's something the government has no control at an immediate buyer level, right? And happens outside, right, of just traditional acquisition systems. Anyone today, you can go online, anyone today can buy a highly capable quadcopter that can fly over 45 miles an hour beyond visual range with full first person viewer. You can go online real quick and build your own little target identifier, all on open source, very low code. If I can do it, you can do it. This is available today. This all happened, right? Because what has started to occur is that what I think certainly what Dr. Gansler was talking about in his early books in the, he wrote Affording Defense, I think in 94, was that at the time, people were like, oh, we can buy, the government can buy semiconductors, we can buy certain software systems, nowhere near the size and scale today, from the commercial market because they're already being built. We don't have to pay for any of that RDT&E funding. Someone else is doing that now. And that's a great idea. And that was a great way for the department to get increase its capability without having to pay a ton of budget up front. What happens when this starts ripping? That's the question that's in front of everyone today. And certainly something that I've lived in my own little part through my career. The question, though, one of the questions that exists is originally dual use was always viewed as this commercial first, we'll bring it in, right, into the government, right? Government doesn't make its own TVs, right? The market does. Right? You go inside any government building, right? They're not having their own flat screens, they're having Dell, Vizio. This is why Walmart bought Vizio, right? Because they were trying to figure out how we can expand into greater and greater commoditized markets. But money, right, as liquidity has increased and policy changes have unfolded, you're starting to see more money chase look for new upside. One of those new upsides is flipping things on its head, saying, I'm not just going to do commercial first, but I'm also going to start looking to say, I have so much capital floating around. Why don't I try some new defense only? Let me take a direct run at the primes. Maybe we can do it better this time around, right? And so in the current market today, certainly one in which I operate in, you have a mixture of startups that are trying to be dual use, commercial, public sector. The company that I am now leading, we are commercial first in the public sector. And we went out, the company built out, we're going to go figure out how to deploy Kubernetes environments anywhere. And now we're going to figure out how to employ that inside the public sector. That's different than saying, I'm going to go build an X Prime, but I'm going to do it better, faster, more efficient, cheaper, and cooler. So you have all this money, but you also have the government through fits and starts trying to figure out how to access it. I'm going to start in the middle because that's where I worked for over 7 years. I started on the investment team and left on leading our AI group. But you know, In-Q-Tel's charter, I studied it when I was here. It was still in its early days then, but its charter was to provide access to its original pitch was to provide access to Silicon Valley. Government didn't even know what the companies were, who to talk to, how to get in there, how to evaluate. You know, I started there in 2013. When I left in 2020, very different world, very rapidly. So when I started, none of this existed. None of it. There's no government programs. There was no, well, SIBRs and STTRs did, but all these special vehicles or program offices did not exist. Fast forward in a 7-year time period, now they all exist. And this is a whole separate class on how well these things work, if what their success stories or lack thereof are, but they all highlight an example. Out to go back. How do we get around this? This is too slow, takes too long, integration efforts, we have too high of a fail rate. So at their core, they're all trying to poke at that problem. How do we make that go faster? How do we get new entrants involved? How do we bridge gaps out of that 6.4 to 6.5 funding? And equally now, you now have these kind of beyond In-Q-Tel, you now have these emerging sort of much more expansive public-private partnership models, which were more expansive than I think anyone was thinking about, certainly when I was a student here, where OSC, the Office of Strategic Capital, they just announced their latest round of debt for, they're acting as a general partner to different venture funds in the tune of a little under $1 billion, just to serve as a limited partner to get cash out into the market, to have those funds on behalf of the government go out and seek investment in those 14 CTAs I mentioned. On top of that, then you have this whole new set of investors that are exclusively focused on building their investment priorities around this whole sector. So like anything else, the ecosystem grows and grows. Bigger doesn't mean better. It doesn't mean more efficient. It doesn't mean better outcomes. It just means that more is growing around it. And now you have more stakeholders interested in the outcome. All of this makes it harder. Imagine the current debate inside the Pentagon right now with the DepSecDef, which is Steve Feinberg. He was Steve Feinberg, private equity. He was focused on this at Cerberus and Tracker Capital. He knows the market very well. But now he's in the government seat. He's got to go, how do I align from a highest level policy perspective all of these tools to remotely kind of go in the right direction so we can achieve an outcome and build capability that's sustainable. It's boom time for startups. More as I have come to learn, the ability to raise capital and the ability to earn capital, very different things, but they both have their own excitement. I'm certainly in that latter category now. Okay, it's time to earn. But I highlight this because not that we should besmirch the ability to raise capital, but this is a market movement, and this tells you where momentum is going. And all of this capital is going to look for some sort of return. This now creates another policy initiative in front of our department, and every startup that is working in this should think about this, because this is how acquisition officials view us, which is taste winning over requirements. More specifically, what's the ideal capital structure for new entrants coming into this market? It's one thing when you're a smaller company like ours, where we fit within the bounds and all the sort of financial models that exist in the current ADG category. So if someone were to buy us, evaluate us, they'd look and say, I understand that. That makes sense. But when you have now the sheer quantum of industrial capacity going into certain startups, driven outside of the funding requirements, you now have this question of, and Earl, I have a lot of friends there, so no bias, but they're now sitting at a $14 billion valuation, trading at N times higher multiple than any other ADG company would. So now you have this trade-off that was you had no interest in as a policymaker that you now must answer, which is this an acceptable capital structure? And can we rely on this type of provider given that capital structure for some of our programs? Or does this turn upside down? And do we put the department, the IC, your fill in the blank, civilian agency, do we put our mission at risk if we over-index on a new supplier that maybe has an uncertain balance sheet? Or at least an uncertain balance sheet in terms of achieving its level of revenue or its level of valuation. These are now decision points that I think if you were an acquisition official, if you were a senior official in one of the services or one of the intelligence agencies, a couple of years ago, none of this would have come up. I mean, go listen to the testimonies. It's the absolute truth. Fast forward to today, set aside any feelings you may have about any of the current officials testifying. This stuff's coming up because you put some of the political components aside. People have to look at the math and they have to understand what's happening in our industry. If we are to trade off or change force structure, is this the type of setup that we want? Any new company that's coming into this is now coming into this system, understanding that, going back to the budgeting process, you're either changing, you're attacking a new requirement that does not exist, your taste. I think this type of autonomous vessel that does not exist in the fleet is better than the current force construction. Or, and I'm living this right now, say that we fit in the current bid structure, but we have a better product or a better go-to-market plus product, right? Which is more in line with how the department is ready to consume and buy technology. And so, as closing thoughts, we'll go to questions. It used to be, how do you move this massive bureaucratic system with huge budgets to execute a mission? That in and of itself is complex enough. Now you're adding into it, it's more dynamic than ever. So take your pick of technology updates. I look at our product stack. I first started looking, I didn't work at the company yet, I was evaluating it as an investor at the time. Its product just on our core offering of how to orchestrate software apps inside a data center changed hundreds of times, literally hundreds of versions, right, in years. And we're a lower end example of that. I think anything in the AI category, it's much more aggressive. And how do you also align in a highly disaggregated environment? What I'm interested in as a government may be different than what's happening for a capital allocator. Not completely different, but maybe. What are our evolving roles, right? This is something that I think going back to we mentioned at the beginning, 2009 had its moments of chaos, and certainly today does as well. But that also means that there's opportunities, right, to position yourself in a way that may be more impactful that didn't exist, certainly when I was coming out of school. The third is, how do we look at something from a sustainability perspective? What happens if a lot of that outside capital, going back to that chart, what if a lot of that falls out or just doesn't grow or even declines by 10%? What are the implications of that? These are now things that have to be considered as part of the larger force structure, planning structure. And that also ties to the risk ahead. What can we learn from the past? It's not an exact science, certainly, but there are maybe some things that we should consider from that. A lot of the companies that came out during the late 90s boom, early aughts, some of which were highly baselined in defense systems, there was a lot of pain that came through, but some of those technologies grew out into new companies. right? And I think one of the things writ large, right, if you're interested in the sector, whether it's an operator, an allocator, a researcher, military, or policy, is that I think writ large, people would want to look and say, we want to do it better than what we did in the past, right? Because we went through this whole cycle of not understanding that market, and then we created all these acquisition systems to get in. How can we avoid that regardless of what kind of happens in the years ahead? So this was sort of an entire primer on the defense sector, what's happening in new entrants, as well as a little bit of what's happening on the venture side. But I was hoping it would serve as at least a good jumping off point for discussions, anything you all are thinking about or questions you may have. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And here's the plug. We should create a class on this. That's the plug. Rohan, yes. What's our startup doing?
No. I was wondering, why do we seek to disaggregate the primes when the primes are what have the economies of scale that enable us to like produce mass structures to meet the needs of future warfare?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Bill, Charlie, do you want me to take it, or do you want to get off? Well, one of the common critiques is, and this can get kind of silly pretty quick, is that time on delivery and cost structures are not remotely consistent with, I think, any end user expectation, right? I think the best takeaway line, which goes back to the great consolidation effect, was, and it's quoted in Dr. Ganser's book, but Norm Augustine, who was the CEO of Lockheed Martin at the time, and he was chairman at InQtel when I was still there. He used to joke that, by whatever it was, 2025, the US Air Force will spend, billions of dollars and get one aircraft in 15 years, right? Because cost, delays, and the entire system that those primes have to operate in was not conducive to producing better, faster, cheaper. And whatever you think about new incumbents, they do things faster. And then I've worked with a lot of the software, a lot of it is better, depending on your mission and depending on what you're trying to achieve. And so I think one of the things is, how can we reinsert some of that vigor and incentive into those primes? You could argue only startups could do that. You could also argue, to pick on Lockheed as a good example, they just announced their concept for fielding a highly low cost subsonic cruise missile at $150K a copy. Right now, their cruise missiles, supersonic, are millions of dollars a copy, right? So they're already thinking, how do we move into that attributable environment? How do we do so that benefits in an economic way our balance sheet? That was something that they were not thinking about years ago. You could argue they were indifferent to the world and they had to be forced. You could also argue that the contracting and financial structures that exist today didn't allow them to be so. That's that point of friction. So one would say they're too slow and inefficient. They have to be disaggregated or challenged. We don't have enough competition. That'd be the classic economist argument. Their response back to that would be, sure, but take the handcuffs off us and let us run a little bit. That is where, and put this in the context of careers, wherever you, I'll speak for myself. If I was going into that environment, the expectations of what you could do, how you'd be assessed, and how you'd be evaluated, and where your career would go would be different. At Lockheed, you'd be like, I either want to learn a core program so I become the expert, then I want to figure out how I can optimize that work program or bring in something new. If you're in a startup, you're the opposite, right? You're David, and you're trying to prove yourself against Goliath to say, we can take them down, right? We will get a major program of record. We will go into LRAP, right? We will go into ongoing production. No right answer there.
I'm happy to answer your question. So a lot of times, first of all, like, the environment that you paint is very interesting. And, just even in my own career, working in the intelligence community, I remember, first starting as a kind of a new employee of the NSA, thinking, I'm going to see kind of the world's greatest technology stack, is, this is the creme de la creme of technology deployment, only to be highly disappointed when I showed up and I realized, wow, some of this is really quite ancient. But in the eighties and the seventies and the sixties and the fifties, I mean, NSA really did, was really kind of pointing in the spear with like cutting edge tech. That has fundamentally changed, as you point out, in your presentation. From a cybersecurity perspective, it opens up, I think, a whole set of complications and potential risks, right? Because, as you want to introduce cutting edge tech, cloud-based systems, IoT systems, kind of integrated network systems, it opens up a larger attack surface for the entire, Department of Defense and all their weapon systems. So how would you kind of characterize the ability for the US government, the DoD specifically, to manage that operational risk from just a cyber perspective, not putting aside other types of threats? Just anxious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I mean, you have kind of the enterprise approach, right? Which is certainly that back of the house that I mentioned, right? That is, let's put that into one bucket. Then you have the front of the house, or the lethality piece, the warfighting piece, and that goes into another. And what has historically, I'm going to speak in extreme generalizations, you obviously know this, but what historically happened was that front of the house, right? That gets locked and that is preserved, and we don't allow any risk into that system. The danger with that is anyone who's been out there in the field, been out there in any forward operating position, they'll tell you, and certainly again witnessing a lot of this firsthand, you're not getting a up-to-date user experience, right? And in some cases, right, it is laughable. In other cases, it's very dangerous, right? Because warfighters need to stay in the cutting edge. And so what you're starting to see, and I think, and certainly companies like mine are in that sector, have started to think much more about sort of security first for highly sensitive edge systems, and what does it mean to have enterprise grade cybersecurity systems in the back of the house. I think you know much better than me, but I think one of the things that has writ large tried to permeate across the agency, which exists in commercial environments more permissively, is just accepting more risk, accepting things that are going to fail, right? And that I shouldn't be flippant about that, but certainly the concept of having software breaches, so when I came out, right, we would have I would go on site and we used to re-joke, I'm recreating the internet over here, right? Because everything was separate. That's not the case now. And so I think adopting best commercial practices is kind of where you see things going. How that interfaces with the front of the house capability, that remains to be seen, right? Because all of the autonomy, functionality, that sounds great, looks great in a war game, looks great in practice. We're seeing play out in real time, both in Ukrainian theater as well as in the Gazan contingent, that those systems can fall down very quickly. And then it's one thing if you have a tiered approach, but if we are leaning too heavy on any one of those approaches, you have a massive exposure. And your risk factor is far beyond just whether or not you have secure systems, but whether you have any capability in theater at all. Right. The one concept that I've always thought about is, that I think a lot about, is you'll hear a system, one of the major programs with the Air Force called ABMS, Advanced Battle Management Systems. They have your core data center component, they have edge components, they have flight systems. And this sort of networked warfighter is one of those things that it goes, man, this looks great in a test. But what happens if you pop that network? And what redundancies, if any, do you build into it? And this is true for the warfighter, it's true certainly in intelligence ops, where we're taking things certainly on the SIGINT side. And so that is a real-time debate that happens. And I would highly suspect the level of scrutiny, even though in the little slice of the world that I operate in, is so much more extreme than what it was even just 2 to 3 years ago.
I know this is speculative, but so NATO's not dead yet, but it's looking like it might go that way, right? As the current administration is fuzzy on it. Germany is building up their infrastructure, France is building up their infrastructure. How is the death of NATO, to be a little sensationalist, affecting VC opportunities as like suddenly Germany needs to build their own shit now? The European Union is its own thing, and they don't need to build the 5.56 or just the most basic, right? 5.56 and 7.62 NATO rounds. We don't need to necessarily care about those if NATO disappears. We don't need to care about the interoperability as much. That opens up giant opportunities in Europe to invest more in Saab and whoever builds their shit.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, which is what's happening right inside of NATO, you know, or any, we can come to a couple other alliances too, as an example, because I spent more of my time in work supporting Pacific theater allies. But in the case of NATO, you know, you have, I think, a general idea that they have to rebuild capability from, in some cases, implicit in your point, from the ground up. We can debate whether they should do that, whether that's appropriate. That's a separate political discussion. But at least in the current phase of things, you know, their ability to rapidly buy and field capability, one could argue, has been the biggest love letter to the U.S. defense industrial base that exists. It's where most of the equipment is being bought. They may have their own sort of fielding capability, but ultimately they're buying through majority of their dollars go through U.S. industrial suppliers. So their logic is, and rightly so, although it's from my little, not that I know that much, but they're still trying to figure out where to best apply their time, is do they want to replicate certain US capability or just buy it? Or where can they get an asymmetric advantage with newer technologies? And you're starting to see their innovation fund and some of their other nation states go into capabilities that have lower barriers to entry. Think back to that acquisition process. They're thinking about drones and doing custom design for the shape charts to go on drones, right? That's something they can do. You don't need $800 billion machine to go do that. You know, US, right? We buy a non-zero amount of the 155 rounds that go in artillery pieces from Europe, right? So they're already kind of doing some of this. And so I think what you will see, certainly as the way the capital is going, is that you'll have certainly more suppliers, whether they're European or they're coming out of Indo-Pacific suppliers as well, that are carving out their desired niches. And if you're a US policymaker or someone operating the US system, you're thinking does that pose a risk as maybe some acquisition moves away from us? Or do we care, right? And we see this as a way to simply expand the supplier base in a way, right? From the investor perspective, my prior life, the Stanford Fund was very focused on working directly in the United States as well as in Europe, as well as in the Indo-Pacific. So a lot of the macro political pieces were kind of discussed, but not really. Like I was surprised. You'd be surprised how little it came up on a transaction by transaction basis.
So I noticed that your defense industry graphs tended to start in the 80s, and your defense valuation graphs tended to start in the 2000s. And I guess since the 2000s, one thing that has been consistent has been an assumption that defense budget would, inevitably rise indefinitely. And that was probably a good bet until 2-3 months ago. I'm just curious, in the last, 2 to 3 months, if you've seen or heard a change in questioning that assumption, if not in terms of current dollars, even in terms of the ability for the US government with the bond markets and things like that to sustain current defense levels, and if that's changing the ROI calculus within private capital investment.
Absolutely. Right, I think regardless of who is in the White House, this discussion is inevitable, right? And to look and say that, and this is, I'm not making a political pronouncement, but the budget cannot always go up. And that is true of any agency, any service, anything that we as putting our policymakers hats on, right? That's not sustainable because if for nothing else, it starts robbing other core services or other core tasks that the government has to focus on. Interestingly enough, it's not just a US topic, but this is a topic certainly in Europe as well. How much can their economy bear, right, to rearm and reinvest, right? It doesn't have the ability to rebuild an entire, for example, nuclear capability. This is true in the Indo-Pacific theater as well, both with allies and adversaries, right? They're making these balancing acts as well. And I think where to put on your I'm interested in this sector hat, where I think some of the best or some of the most conversations rely around is solutions that lower both the front of the house cost and the back of the house cost. Right. And the risk in there is you're making, and our business is no different than any other, we're making guesses about where we think the best savings and value back to the government and the taxpayer are. Reality is that's unknown until we figure out, until program decisions are made. Right. Like an example of like something that would be unknowable right now is what happens with, for example, like the Golden Dome. I haven't gone to any of those events. I have no idea about any of that system other than it's gold with a dome, right? Is that a real thing or not? If it's real, that will have to pull capital away from other core priorities, right? If you look in other parts of the world, like, Chinese ship building and ship repair capability is a top tier priority to them. They made that decision. And whether right or wrong, that came at the expense of other capital investments that they made into their force structure. I think in the back of the house, I've worked in IT or tech most of my career. You're going to see a lot of this discussion happen. And I think the canary in the coal mine for this was the revisiting of the software acquisition pathway, which is to say it's taking buy commercial first on steroids. Say we're not going to have a ton of licenses, we're not going to buy duplicative work. All of that is going to have to go into optimizing spend. And I would suspect for capital allocators, if you're not, and this was true in my prior life, if you're not looking at the implications of how that startup or business is going to operate in that world, you're putting yourself and your limited partners at extreme risk. Like I'll say this rhetorically, a huge bread and butter, just absolute moneymaker in the ADG sector for years has been professional technical services. Hands down, right? I mean, I started at one in Computer Sciences Corporation, so I lived it. And consolidation of those businesses, throws off huge amounts of cash. If I were highly exposed on the private equity side right now, I'd be very concerned about what my balance sheet was going to look like in a couple of years. Not because those are bad investments, but because how are you going to get the outsized return you need to justify to your investors the position you made, particularly when the desire is to drive down headcount and to automate with software and things like that. So I think some sectors are going to take some real hits.
Fortunately, I think that's all the time we have, but I want to thank Ryan for joining us and another round.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Well, thank you to everyone for coming.